The story begins with a singular, chilling account that has haunted the town for decades, a traveler who stepped into a modestly furnished room within an old, decaying house, only to emerge claiming that mere moments had passed, while the world outside had experienced days. The scene opens with a vivid description of the room's dim lighting, the faint scent of aged wood and dust, and the peculiar arrangement of furniture that seems almost deliberate in its stillness. There is an unsettling quiet, broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards beneath one's feet and the distant hum of the town beyond. The traveler's tale is both simple and confounding, painting a picture of a reality where time itself seems to suspend, leaving those who enter the room suspended between disbelief and terror. The narrative immediately emphasizes the impossibility of the event, invoking an emotional response from the audience, curiosity mixed with an underlying sense of dread. From the outset, the tension is heightened by the uncertainty surrounding the traveler's account. Was it an exaggeration born of fatigue, or did something truly inexplicable occur? The audience is guided to consider the nature of time, the fragility of human perception, and the eerie possibility that ordinary reality might bend or fracture within the confines of a single room. Vivid imagery is employed to immerse viewers in the experience, the soft, golden light filtering through cracked window panes, the long shadow stretching across the patterned rug, and the subtle stillness that seems almost alive, as though the room itself is conscious and aware of intruders. Every detail is designed to make the viewer feel the oppressive weight of the space, to sense that something is profoundly wrong, yet tantalizingly alluring. The narrative then introduces additional accounts, scattered through journals and letters, of people who encountered the room and described a similar suspension of time. A visiting scholar noted that clocks stopped functioning the moment he crossed the threshold, and no matter how many times he reset them, the hands would remain frozen or jump erratically. Servants who had worked in the house spoke of disorientation, of entering the room expecting only a moment's pause but emerging to find entire evenings had slipped away. These early reports are presented not merely as anecdotes but as glimpses into a phenomenon that defies conventional explanation. Each story is layered with the emotional texture of fear, fascination, and disbelief, emphasizing the psychological tension that accompanies such an inexplicable experience. To enhance the cinematic feel, the narration dwells on sensory details, the oppressive stillness, the faint whisper of wind through broken shutters, the subtle way the air seems heavier inside the room. There is also a focus on the human responses to the anomaly, hesitation at the doorway, instinctive withdrawal, and the tension between curiosity and survival. By framing the room not just as a physical space but as a psychological and emotional trap, the audience is drawn into the unfolding mystery, experiencing the fear and intrigue alongside the original witnesses. The suspense is methodically built, emphasizing slow-burning dread rather than abrupt shocks, creating a lingering sense of unease that will permeate the narrative. The historical context of the house is hinted at in this opening section, though details are reserved for later sections. References are made to its long-standing presence in the town, its faded grandeur, and the shadows of tragedies that seem embedded within its walls. This background establishes a foundation of realism. The house is not merely a supernatural construct but a tangible place with a history, lending weight to the mysterious events. The narration contrasts the mundane reality of the town with the eerie suspension within the room, enhancing the sense of dislocation and reinforcing the room's otherworldly qualities. Psychological aspects are also introduced, as the section explores the human compulsion to measure and understand time, and the terror that arises when those measures fail. Viewers are asked to imagine standing in a space where every instinct about the passage of time is rendered useless, where seconds feel like hours or vanish without notice. The narrative explores the implications of such an experience, disorientation, self-doubt, and the creeping suspicion that reality itself may be unreliable. These early reflections establish the thematic backbone of the documentary, preparing the audience for a story that balances historical mystery with profound psychological tension. Foreshadowing plays a subtle yet critical role. Hints are dropped about later escalations, the room's effects on entire families, the arrival of investigators who cannot comprehend what they encounter, and the interplay between folklore and rational explanation. The section ends by leaving the audience suspended in curiosity, aware that the story they have just glimpsed is only the beginning. The room is framed as both a literal and metaphorical space, a site where the ordinary rules of life are inverted, a locus of fear and fascination that will draw viewers deeper into its dark, enigmatic narrative. The tone is carefully controlled to maintain a slow-burning suspense, evoking emotions that are unsettling but compelling, ensuring the audience is primed for the layers of mystery that will unfold throughout the documentary. This section ultimately establishes the cinematic and emotional framework of the entire story. It is designed to grip viewers immediately, making them feel the room's oppressive stillness, the disorienting effect of time suspended, and the profound psychological and emotional weight of such an anomaly. By blending sensory immersion, historical hints, and human testimony, it sets the stage for a documentary that will explore both the tangible and intangible dimensions of the house, leaving the audience eager, anxious, and unsettled, ready to journey further into a story where time itself refuses to obey. The house that holds the mysterious room is not merely an architectural curiosity but a repository of layered histories and dark secrets that stretch back over a century. Constructed in the late 19th century by a wealthy industrialist family, it sits on the outskirts of a small, isolated town, surrounded by overgrown gardens and the skeletal remains of once grand stone walls. From a distance, the house appears stately, with tall, arched windows, ornate woodwork, and a roofline that cuts jagged silhouettes against the sky. Yet upon closer approach, the air changes, the landscape feels unnatural, the silence oppressive, as if the property itself is guarding something unspeakable. Local lore paints the house as simultaneously awe-inspiring and forbidding, a place where beauty and dread coexist in an uneasy balance. Inside, the house is a labyrinth of shadowed corridors, creaking staircases, and rooms frozen in time, with furniture draped in dust-laden cloths and portraits of long-dead inhabitants staring with accusatory eyes. The room at the center of the story, the one where time reportedly halts, occupies a peculiar position. It is neither grand nor ostentatious, almost deliberately unremarkable, yet it emanates an aura of unnatural stillness that draws attention without inviting comfort. The narration emphasizes the paradox of its ordinary appearance contrasted with its extraordinary effects, establishing an underlying tension that will thread through the story. Every wooden panel, every flickering candle in historical records, seems to bear witness to generations of mysteries and unexplained occurrences. The family who first occupied the house is introduced in careful detail, humanizing the historical backdrop and lending credibility to the unfolding narrative. The patriarch, a man of ambition and peculiar habits, is described as obsessed with order and precision, qualities that extend to the architecture of the house itself. His children, caught between privilege and isolation, navigated a childhood filled with both rigid routines and whispered rumors of strange happenings within certain rooms. Letters and diaries from family members hint at early unease with the house's darker corners, servants disappearing without explanation, fleeting shadows in hallways, and inexplicable cold spots that defied seasonal norms. These accounts provide both atmosphere and narrative footholds, allowing the audience to grasp the lived experience of those closest to the house. Local townspeople contribute a crucial layer to the historical setting. Farmers, shopkeepers, and clergy who lived near the estate speak of the house with a mixture of reverence and fear. Their testimonies paint a picture of a community both fascinated and wary of its influence and wary of what it might conceal. Some recall nights when strange lights flickered behind curtained windows, or the distant sound of footsteps when no one was present. Others remember children refusing to play near the property, instinctively avoiding certain areas without fully understanding why. These accounts are woven seamlessly into the narration, juxtaposing ordinary human life with the subtle, persistent unease surrounding the house. The physical layout of the house is described in a manner that heightens suspense. Narrow hallways branch into dead ends, and certain rooms remain locked for decades, their keys misplaced or intentionally hidden. The mysterious room itself, the epicenter of the story, is positioned in a quiet corner, away from the main corridors, almost as if deliberately isolated. The atmosphere is thickened by descriptions of peeling wallpaper, dim natural light filtering through grime-covered panes, and the faint, lingering smell of old wood and candle smoke. The narration emphasizes the interplay between space and perception, how the architecture itself seems to manipulate movement, attention, and awareness, subtly preparing viewers for the temporal anomalies that will dominate later sections. Folklore and superstition are integral to the house's history. Stories of ghostly figures, strange apparitions, and inexplicable sounds are traced back through oral histories, blending seamlessly with historical records. These tales are presented not as sensationalist exaggerations but as reflections of the cultural and psychological landscape of the town and the family. The juxtaposition of documented history with legend allows the audience to sense that the house operates on multiple levels, as a real place, a psychological force, and a locus for stories that bridge fear, imagination, and reality. The narrative demonstrates how memory, fear, and place converge to shape perception, creating an environment ripe for both mystery and dread. The house's surroundings contribute significantly to its eerie character. Overgrown gardens, with tangled vines and skeletal trees, seem almost to encroach upon the structure, creating a natural barrier that isolates it from the town. Stone pathways are cracked and uneven, as though resisting passage, while distant hills and forests lend a sense of seclusion. The narration emphasizes the sensory experience, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the distant call of an unseen bird, and the way wind whistles through broken shutters, carrying whispers of the past. This natural isolation reinforces the house's role as a self-contained world, where the ordinary rules of time and behavior may not apply, and where the mysterious room's effects can manifest with minimal interference. In establishing the historical setting, the narrative carefully balances realism with foreboding. Precise dates, architectural details, and family histories ground the story, while the layering of shadowy corridors, oppressive quiet, and whispered lore creates a palpable sense of unease. By blending human, architectural, and environmental elements, the audience is drawn into a world that feels tangible yet subtly off-kilter, perfectly primed for the anomalies and psychological tension that will emerge in later sections. The house is presented as a character in its own right, a silent witness to generations, a keeper of secrets, and the stage upon which the eerie narrative of the room unfolds. Ultimately, this section serves to immerse the viewer in the house's complex history and unsettling atmosphere. By combining historical fact, personal testimony, and environmental detail, it creates a foundation for the story's central mystery while cultivating a slow-burning tension. The audience is left with a clear understanding of the house's physical and emotional weight, the family and community dynamics surrounding it, and the subtle hints of something deeply unnatural lying in wait. The stage is set for the phenomena that will soon disrupt both perception and reality, and for the psychological, cultural, and supernatural threads that will weave through the remainder of the documentary. The earliest indications that something was profoundly wrong with the house were subtle, almost imperceptible disturbances, the kind that could easily be dismissed as tricks of the mind or simple misfortune. Servants reported minor inconsistencies in the passage of time, noticing clocks that seemed to stop mid-tick or skip forward in erratic bursts. These anomalies were often first attributed to faulty mechanisms or the natural aging of household objects, but over time, the pattern grew too persistent to ignore. The narrative emphasizes the gradual accumulation of oddities, creating a slow-burn sense of unease that mirrors the experiences of those who lived and worked in the house. Even simple tasks, such as preparing meals or maintaining the estate, began to feel disjointed, as if the normal rhythm of life was subtly but insistently being disrupted. Visitors and family members alike described a strange disorientation that occurred near certain areas of the house, particularly the room that would later become infamous. A young governess recalled entering the space to fetch a book, only to feel as though she had been standing in the room for hours, when in reality only a few minutes had passed. She described a sensation of weight pressing against her chest, accompanied by a faint, inexplicable hum that seemed to resonate from the walls themselves. Others reported that when leaving the room, time outside seemed to move with an unnatural acceleration, as though the world beyond had shifted forward while they remained suspended. These experiences were deeply unsettling, prompting confusion and fear, and establishing the psychological tension that would dominate subsequent interactions with the house. The section also explores the human response to the early anomalies, highlighting both skepticism and dread. Some residents dismissed the reports as exaggerations, claiming that stress, fatigue, or imagination were to blame. Others grew increasingly wary, noting that the longer someone remained near the anomalous room, the more pronounced the disorientation became. The narrative examines the delicate interplay between perception and reality, suggesting that the human mind may struggle to reconcile the ordinary with the inexplicable. Emotional reactions ranged from mild curiosity to outright terror, and the house began to acquire a reputation as a place where logic and expectation failed, where time itself could not be trusted. Patterns of disturbance are traced in careful detail, showing how the anomalies escalated over time. Initially, the effects were minor, slightly off-kilter clocks, small lapses in memory, fleeting sensations of vertigo, but they grew progressively more pronounced. Objects left in the room would reappear in different locations, letters or manuscripts would be partially altered without explanation, and fleeting glimpses of movement at the edges of vision were frequently reported. The narrative emphasizes that these early disturbances were not isolated incidents but part of a developing phenomenon, a slow crescendo that hinted at forces beyond ordinary comprehension. These anomalies were both physical and psychological, blending the tangible with the intangible, and setting the stage for the more dramatic events to come. Eyewitness testimony is central to this section, lending both realism and emotional depth. Diary entries and letters describe the anxiety and confusion felt by those who first encountered the disturbances. A local scholar, tasked with maintaining records of the household, wrote of his frustration at measuring the passage of time only to find his instruments unreliable within the confines of certain rooms. He described feeling mentally fragmented, as if his thoughts had fallen out of sequence, and noted the growing dread that permeated the household. These personal accounts humanize the phenomenon, allowing the audience to understand not only the objective strangeness of the events but also the psychological impact on those who lived through them. The narrative also touches on attempts to rationalize the early anomalies. Servants and family members speculated about drafts, peculiar acoustics, or environmental factors such as temperature fluctuations. Some sought religious or superstitious explanations, believing that the house had been cursed or that ancestral spirits lingered within its walls. These efforts to impose meaning on the inexplicable highlight the tension between reason and belief, a central theme that will continue throughout the documentary. The audience is invited to consider multiple perspectives, recognizing the limits of human understanding while simultaneously feeling the weight of the mystery. In addition to human experience, the section explores environmental cues that contributed to the sense of unease. Light behaves oddly in the room, casting shadows that shift unpredictably as if detached from the sun's natural movement. Sounds are distorted, with footsteps, whispers, or creaking floorboards appearing delayed or amplified. Even the air itself seems charged, with subtle changes in temperature or pressure creating sensations of heaviness or constriction. These sensory anomalies reinforce the perception that the room operates according to its own rules, independent of the external world, and heighten the audience's sense of anticipation and dread. The cumulative effect of these early disturbances is carefully emphasized. What begins as minor, almost dismissible oddities evolves into a pervasive sense of unreality that infiltrates daily life. Individuals become hyper-aware of temporal inconsistencies, mistrust their own memories, and struggle to maintain routine. The narrative draws attention to the emotional and psychological consequences of such experiences, illustrating how the human mind reacts when the very fabric of time appears unstable. Anxiety, suspicion, and obsession emerge as recurring patterns, foreshadowing the more extreme psychological and social consequences that will dominate later sections. By the end of this section, the audience is fully immersed in the unsettling reality of the house's temporal disturbances. The early anomalies are portrayed not as sensationalist horror but as slow-building, credible phenomena that blend physical, psychological, and emotional dimensions. The narrative carefully balances description, testimony, and theoretical speculation, ensuring that the audience both understands and feels the disorienting effects of the house. The stage is set for the escalation of events, as the room's influence begins to permeate not only the household but also the wider community, establishing a foundation of suspense, tension, and intrigue that will propel the story forward. As the house's anomalies grew more pronounced, individual experiences began to accumulate into a tapestry of first-hand accounts, each one adding depth and texture to the mystery of the room. These testimonies ranged from casual observations to detailed journal entries, and together they painted a picture of a place where time itself seemed to bend and warp. One of the earliest and most compelling accounts came from a young governess, who described entering the room to retrieve a forgotten book and feeling as though she had been there for hours, while outside only a few moments had passed. She noted an oppressive stillness, a sensation that the walls themselves seemed to absorb sound, and the subtle, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Her written reflections, preserved in family archives, conveyed both fear and awe, illustrating the emotional impact of encountering a phenomenon that defied all rational explanation. Other witnesses described similar experiences, but each with unique nuances that highlighted the room's unpredictable nature. A visiting scholar, intrigued by rumors of temporal irregularities, entered the space equipped with a pocket watch and a journal. According to his account, the watch repeatedly malfunctioned, sometimes racing forward and at other times stopping completely. He recorded a sense of vertigo and disorientation, accompanied by a vague sensation that his thoughts were fragmenting, as if the normal sequence of memory had been scrambled. The scholar's meticulous observations lent credibility to the phenomenon, providing both a scientific perspective and a deeply human narrative of confusion and growing dread. Servants and household staff also contributed vital testimony. Their accounts were often less formal but equally compelling, reflecting the day-to-day interactions with the room. One maid reported objects subtly shifting position over time, items she had placed carefully in a particular spot appearing hours or days later in a completely different location. Others spoke of fleeting shadows at the edges of vision, or whispers that seemed to echo within the walls but without an identifiable source. These experiences were often dismissed by outsiders as imagination or overactive nerves, yet the consistency of reports across different individuals suggested that something genuinely extraordinary was occurring. The audience is drawn into the tension between skepticism and belief, sensing that while the human mind may exaggerate, the cumulative weight of repeated observations hints at an underlying reality beyond ordinary comprehension. The emotional impact of these experiences is a key focus of the narrative. Witnesses describe a range of feelings, from the mild curiosity of those encountering minor oddities to profound fear and existential unease for those spending longer periods in the room. One young child, left in the care of the house, reportedly refused to enter a particular corner of the room, citing a heavy air that made him feel like time had stopped. Adults who encountered the same phenomena described feelings of nausea, dizziness, and a strange detachment from their own sense of self. The section emphasizes how the room's influence extends beyond the mere perception of time, affecting mental states, emotional stability, and the very sense of reality itself. The narrative also explores contrasting perspectives, highlighting the tension between the rational and the supernatural. Some witnesses attempted to approach the room scientifically, measuring time with instruments or conducting experiments to quantify the anomalies. These individuals often ended their accounts with frustration and confusion, noting that their data was inconsistent or outright nonsensical. Others turned to folklore and superstition, interpreting the room as cursed, haunted, or protected by unseen forces. By presenting multiple viewpoints, the narration encourages the audience to consider the phenomenon from both empirical and imaginative lenses, reinforcing the story's slow-building suspense and psychological complexity. Letters and journals preserved in the household archives offer particularly vivid glimpses into the room's effects. A young woman, whose writing reveals both intellect and sensitivity, described her experience with a poetic attention to detail, the way light shifted across the floor, the stillness that pressed against her ears, and the feeling that her perception of reality had been subtly altered. She wrote of entering the room expecting only to accomplish a mundane task, only to emerge hours later with no clear recollection of how the time had passed. These personal reflections humanize the phenomenon, grounding it in emotional truth even as the events themselves strain belief. The narration emphasizes that these accounts are not sensationalized. They are careful observations imbued with the anxiety, wonder, and bewilderment of those who encountered something beyond ordinary understanding. The section further examines patterns among the witnesses' experiences. Despite variations in age, social status, and purpose for entering the house, commonalities emerge: disorientation, temporal distortion, and a pervasive feeling of being watched or contained within an invisible boundary. The narrative underscores the idea that the room exerts a consistent influence while remaining unpredictable in its manifestations. Some individuals emerge unharmed, though shaken, others exhibit lasting psychological effects, including obsessive thoughts about the room, difficulty maintaining normal routines, or an enduring sense of unease that lingers long after leaving. The audience is encouraged to reflect on the human cost of encountering forces that defy explanation, deepening the emotional resonance of the story. Interpersonal dynamics also play a role in shaping these accounts. Witnesses sometimes confided their experiences to family or colleagues, only to be met with disbelief or dismissal. These social pressures amplify the sense of isolation and anxiety, as individuals struggle to reconcile what they know with what others are willing to accept. In some cases, the refusal of others to acknowledge the phenomena leads to secretive behaviors, clandestine investigations, or even obsessive documentation of personal experiences. This interplay between the private and public spheres adds psychological complexity to the narrative, emphasizing that the room's influence extends beyond temporal anomalies to affect relationships, trust, and communal understanding. By the conclusion of this section, the audience has a rich, multifaceted view of the room's effect on those who entered. Witness accounts provide both empirical detail and emotional texture, allowing the audience to experience disorientation, fear, and awe alongside the subjects. The cumulative testimony establishes the room as an active, almost sentient presence, capable of altering perception and influencing human behavior in profound ways. The section balances realism with eeriness, blending historical documentation with vivid, cinematic storytelling, and setting the stage for the escalation of events that will follow in subsequent sections. The whispers of the room, once subtle and easily dismissed, are now clearly a force that shapes both reality and human experience, leaving viewers both unsettled and deeply invested in the unfolding mystery. As the unsettling reports of the room's anomalies spread through the town, a wave of public denial and religious oppression emerged, shaping the narrative in ways as chilling as the phenomena themselves. Local clergy, alarmed by tales of time suspended and disoriented visitors, labeled any investigation of the room as sacrilegious, urging families to avoid it entirely. Sermons warned of the dangers of meddling with forces beyond human comprehension, framing the house not merely as a curiosity but as a locus of moral and spiritual corruption. Town records reveal that incidents were often downplayed or deliberately omitted, official explanations citing accidents, hallucinations, or simple exaggeration. This institutional denial created an atmosphere in which fear and secrecy flourished, forcing residents to question their perceptions while simultaneously silencing open discussion. Families connected to the house found themselves caught between curiosity, dread, and social pressure. Some attempted to report strange occurrences only to face ridicule or condemnation, while others were pressured to conceal their experiences to maintain social standing. Servants who documented anomalies in diaries were sometimes accused of lying or imagination, and their accounts were dismissed by authorities and peers alike. The tension between private knowledge and public expectation amplified the psychological strain on individuals, creating a pervasive sense of isolation. Fear was compounded by religious rhetoric suggesting that the room was a test of faith or a manifestation of divine punishment, further complicating the community's ability to confront the inexplicable. Public denial also manifested in subtle, systemic ways. Town officials discouraged outsiders from visiting the house, and some even went so far as to falsify records of accidents or temporal irregularities to maintain the illusion of normalcy. Social gatherings included whispered warnings not to speak of the house in public, and local newspapers avoided mention of its more disturbing phenomena. This suppression was not merely protective, it was a reflection of collective anxiety, a desire to assert control over a situation that seemed fundamentally uncontrollable. The audience begins to sense that the house's influence extends beyond its walls, shaping social norms, communication, and collective memory. The narrative also explores the complex psychology behind religious suppression. Clergy and devout residents often viewed the room through the lens of morality, framing anomalies as temptations or tests from higher powers. This moral interpretation created a binary of obedience and transgression, where entering or investigating the room was equated with sin. Some townspeople internalized these beliefs, experiencing guilt or fear simply for acknowledging the room's existence. The tension between rational curiosity and religious doctrine intensified the sense of dread, as individuals had to navigate both the inexplicable phenomena and the social and spiritual consequences of engaging with them. Stories of public suppression are interwoven with accounts of human resilience and curiosity. Despite warnings, some individuals continued to observe or document the room covertly, keeping journals or secretly experimenting with clocks and timepieces. These clandestine efforts often carried heavy emotional weight, as observers risked social censure, ostracism, or spiritual condemnation. Their determination highlights the human drive to understand the unknown, even in the face of societal and religious opposition. The audience is drawn into this conflict, recognizing that the room's influence extends not only to physical or psychological effects but also to the broader dynamics of community, authority, and belief. The section also examines specific incidents where religious intervention directly suppressed investigation. One account details a family who attempted to measure the room's temporal distortions with rudimentary instruments. A visiting priest arrived, condemning the activity as heretical, insisting that curiosity in this matter was spiritually dangerous. Instruments were confiscated, journals burned, and the family warned against further inquiry. Similar interventions are documented in other households, illustrating the breadth of suppression and the power dynamics at play. The audience is left with a sense of how fear, authority, and belief converge to constrain knowledge and understanding, amplifying the room's mystique by limiting empirical observation. Social and psychological consequences of denial are explored in depth. Individuals who experienced anomalies often found themselves doubting their own senses and memories, compounded by the insistence of others that the events were impossible. Some became secretive, reluctant to share observations even with trusted family members, while others internalized guilt or fear as a moral failing. The narrative emphasizes the isolation created by such social pressure, showing how the room's influence extends beyond temporal distortions to affect relationships, trust, and the very fabric of community life. The interplay between personal experience and public suppression heightens tension, reinforcing the house as both a physical and social enigma. Folklore and rumor also became tools of suppression and control. Tales of punishments for those who entered the room, or curses that befell families who dared to investigate, circulated widely. While some stories served to discourage exploration, others inadvertently fueled curiosity, creating a paradoxical effect in which fear and fascination coexisted. This duality underscores a central tension in the narrative. The room's mystery is both amplified and constrained by human interpretation and societal reaction. The audience is encouraged to consider how narrative, belief, and authority shape the experience of phenomena, and how cultural context can intensify the psychological impact of the unknown. By the end of this section, the audience has a clear understanding of how public denial and religious suppression shaped the history of the house and the perception of the room. The narrative emphasizes that the room's mysteries cannot be fully understood without considering the social, cultural, and spiritual forces that influenced witnesses, investigators, and townspeople. Denial and suppression act as both protective and oppressive forces, creating tension and secrecy while heightening the room's enigmatic power. The audience is left with a growing sense of unease, recognizing that the story of the room is not only about temporal anomalies but also about the complex interplay between human curiosity, authority, and the limits of perception. As the mysterious phenomena of the room continued, its influence escalated, extending beyond mere temporal anomalies into profound psychological strain for those who encountered it. Individuals who once regarded the house as an intriguing curiosity began to experience disorientation, anxiety, and a growing sense of dread that permeated every aspect of their daily lives. The narrative begins by describing subtle shifts in behavior among residents and visitors. Servants became hesitant to enter the room, family members lingered near doorways with apprehension, and even the most skeptical scholars began to acknowledge an inexplicable tension in the air. This escalation is presented not as sudden terror but as a slow, creeping psychological pressure, emphasizing the cumulative effect of prolonged exposure to the room's disturbances. Personal testimonies illustrate the deepening strain. A scholar, who had previously approached the anomalies with scientific detachment, described his obsessive attempts to quantify the passage of time within the room. He spent hours observing clocks, measuring intervals with meticulous care, only to find his instruments unreliable and his notes increasingly inconsistent. The experience eroded his confidence in his own perception, leaving him both fascinated and terrified. Another resident, a young servant, began to display symptoms of extreme anxiety, sleeplessness, tremors, and a persistent fear of losing track of time. These psychological manifestations are described in detail, emphasizing how the room's influence extends beyond the physical realm to affect cognition, emotion, and the very sense of reality. The narrative highlights patterns in these escalating effects. Disorientation becomes more pronounced, with individuals reporting feelings of detachment from the passage of time and a sense that the room's boundaries are somehow fluid. Objects appear to shift or vanish, auditory perception is distorted, and subtle changes in lighting and temperature create a sensory environment that confounds expectation. These anomalies are not uniform, each person experiences them differently, which adds to the uncertainty and heightens fear. The audience is invited to empathize with the psychological tension, understanding that the room exerts a powerful, individualized influence on the human mind. Social dynamics within the household and surrounding community reflect the growing psychological strain. Fear and mistrust spread among residents, creating tension in relationships and communication. Some individuals begin to suspect others of exaggeration or dishonesty, while those most affected by the room withdraw into isolation. The narrative emphasizes that the house is not merely a site of temporal distortion but also a psychological landscape, where the very structure of society within the home is subtly, inexorably altered. The audience begins to perceive that the room's effects are both individual and communal, affecting personal experience while reshaping social interactions and hierarchies. Psychological manifestations grow more severe over time. A prominent example is a young historian who devoted himself to documenting every known incident within the room. He became increasingly obsessed, spending long hours inside, pacing, measuring, and recording minutiae with growing desperation. Eventually, he was found wandering outside the house, unable to recall where he had been or how long he had been gone. These cases are presented as evidence that the room's influence is cumulative, with prolonged exposure eroding not only perception of time but also memory, rational thought, and emotional stability. The narrative draws attention to the interplay between curiosity and compulsion, showing how fascination with the unknown can itself become a psychological trap. The section also examines the physiological and cognitive effects on those exposed to the room. Symptoms include vertigo, disorientation, confusion, and the sensation of being watched or constrained by invisible forces. Testimonies describe feeling suspended between states of consciousness, unable to orient themselves in space or time. Sleep patterns are disrupted, and some individuals experience vivid, dreamlike hallucinations or auditory distortions. These detailed descriptions reinforce the idea that the room's influence extends beyond mere perception, affecting the body, mind, and emotional state simultaneously. By grounding these experiences in sensory and psychological realism, the narrative maintains credibility while heightening suspense. Attempts to rationalize these escalating effects are presented alongside personal accounts. Investigators and scholars proposed various explanations: environmental factors such as drafts or temperature shifts, psychological projection, or even early experimentation with light and sound manipulation. Yet despite rigorous observation, the room defied consistent measurement. These failures emphasize the limits of human understanding and highlight the tension between rationality and the inexplicable. The narrative encourages the audience to recognize that the escalation of events is not simply supernatural but also deeply psychological, with the room exploiting the vulnerabilities and obsessions of those who enter it. The narrative also addresses the social consequences of psychological strain. Families became fractured, with fear of the room creating divisions and tensions that persisted beyond the household. Some residents attempted to avoid discussion, suppressing curiosity to preserve sanity, while others became secretive investigators, driven by obsession despite warnings. These dynamics illustrate how the room functions as both a physical and social agent, disrupting normal life and reshaping behavior at multiple levels. The audience is shown the cascading effects of exposure, understanding that the room's influence is systemic, affecting mind, body, and community alike. By the end of this section, the escalation of the room's influence is undeniable. Temporal anomalies have become intertwined with psychological distress, and the cumulative effects on perception, emotion, and social dynamics create a palpable tension. The audience witnesses the slow unraveling of rationality, the creeping sense of dread, and the ways in which the house exerts control over both individual and collective experience. This section sets the stage for further attempts to explain the phenomena scientifically or folklorically, highlighting the tension between human curiosity, fear, and the limits of understanding. The slow, inexorable escalation leaves viewers unsettled, primed for the next phase of the narrative where reason, superstition, and human obsession collide in increasingly dramatic fashion. As the phenomena within the house grew more pronounced, attempts to explain the room's strange behavior intensified, producing a fascinating interplay between scientific inquiry and folkloric interpretation. Scholars, local investigators, and curious residents approached the mystery with varying levels of rigor and imagination. Some brought instruments designed to measure the passage of time, while others relied on anecdotal accounts and traditional wisdom. This section explores these efforts in detail, emphasizing the tension between reason and belief and illustrating how human beings attempt to reconcile the unexplainable with frameworks of understanding that are familiar yet inadequate. Scientific investigation began with relatively simple experiments. Observers brought pocket watches, pendulums, and primitive chronometers into the room, recording intervals, documenting any discrepancies, and comparing them with clocks outside. The results were confounding. Instruments would sometimes stop entirely, or the hands would jump erratically without warning. Some observers recorded minutes that felt like hours, while others claimed that hours had passed with no measurable passage of time. These inconsistencies defied conventional physics, creating an intellectual frustration among those who sought empirical explanations. The narrative emphasizes not only the mystery itself but also the emotional toll on investigators, whose confidence in logic and reason was challenged by an invisible, almost sentient force. Beyond timekeeping, researchers attempted to monitor other environmental factors. Temperature, air pressure, humidity, and light were all measured with whatever tools were available at the time. While minor fluctuations were noted, nothing could account for the profound disorientation and temporal distortion reported by witnesses. Some investigators hypothesized that the room's design or materials might contribute, suggesting unusual acoustics, drafts, or reflective surfaces that interfered with perception. Yet repeated trials produced inconsistent results, reinforcing the room's elusiveness and deepening the sense of unease. The audience is guided to appreciate the limits of scientific inquiry when confronted with phenomena that appear to operate outside conventional laws. Parallel to these scientific efforts, folkloric interpretations flourished. Locals and family members alike drew upon centuries-old traditions to make sense of the inexplicable. The room was variously described as cursed, haunted by ancestral spirits, or imbued with divine power. Some believed that the room was a test of moral or spiritual integrity, punishing those who entered with hubris or curiosity. These interpretations were often influenced by cultural beliefs, oral traditions, and religious teachings, reflecting a community attempting to impose narrative order on events that defied comprehension. Folklore, in this sense, functioned both as a warning and as a framework for understanding, offering moral and symbolic explanations where empirical observation failed. The interplay between scientific and folkloric approaches often created tension. Rational investigators sometimes dismissed traditional interpretations as superstition, while locals accused scientists of arrogance or spiritual blindness. Yet, paradoxically, the most compelling explanations often emerged from combining elements of both perspectives, careful observation of anomalies alongside symbolic and moral reasoning about the room's effects. This duality highlights a central theme: human beings are compelled to seek understanding, whether through measurement, narrative, or belief, and the room's mystery cannot be fully apprehended without considering both the tangible and the intangible. Case studies provide particularly vivid examples of this tension. One prominent account describes a scholar who spent weeks documenting the room's effects on time perception. His meticulous notes were detailed and empirical, yet he became increasingly convinced that some moral or spiritual dimension influenced the anomalies. In his later writings, he speculated that the room's temporal distortions might be linked to unresolved trauma or ancestral presence, blending empirical observation with metaphysical conjecture. Such accounts illustrate how even the most rational minds were drawn toward interpretive frameworks that bridged science and folklore, suggesting that the room operates simultaneously on multiple planes: physical, psychological, and symbolic. The narrative also explores the limitations and frustrations of these investigations. Instruments failed, human perception proved unreliable, and repeated experimentation produced no definitive answers. Some observers reported cognitive and emotional strain, including anxiety, obsession, and disorientation, which compromised their ability to conduct rigorous study. These human factors underscore a critical element of the mystery: the room does not merely confound measurement, it affects the mind and behavior of those who attempt to understand it. In this way, the room's influence extends beyond physical phenomena, shaping perception, belief, and interpretation. Folkloric theories themselves were not static but evolved over time. Initial interpretations framed the room as haunted or cursed, while later generations suggested that it was a portal, a site where time itself could be manipulated or suspended. Storytellers embellished early accounts, blending them with local legend and collective memory. The narrative emphasizes how folklore functions as both explanation and cultural artifact, shaping perceptions of reality and influencing behavior. By integrating folklore with historical and scientific accounts, the audience gains a layered understanding of how human beings navigate the intersection of mystery, fear, and knowledge. The section also examines the emotional resonance of these theories. For some, scientific investigation offered hope, a path toward understanding and control. For others, folkloric interpretations provided meaning and moral context, framing the room's dangers within a comprehensible narrative of sin, punishment, or spiritual testing. Both approaches, however, share a common emotional thread: they reflect the human desire to confront and make sense of the unknown. The audience is invited to recognize that the fascination with the room is as much psychological and cultural as it is physical, and that the search for explanation is inseparable from the tension and suspense that permeate the story. By the conclusion of this section, the audience understands that the room defies simple categorization. Scientific experimentation offers insights but no definitive answers, while folklore provides symbolic understanding but cannot quantify the anomalies. The tension between these approaches creates a rich narrative complexity, allowing the audience to appreciate the room's influence on both the mind and culture. This balance of empirical observation and folkloric interpretation sets the stage for the next phase of the story, where isolation, disappearance, and further psychological strain will push both individuals and the community to the limits of comprehension, emphasizing the inescapable and haunting power of the house. As the years progressed and the room's influence intensified, the house became a site of profound psychological and social collapse, affecting not only individual visitors but also the wider household and surrounding community. Those who had once approached the house with curiosity or casual interest increasingly found themselves trapped in cycles of fear, obsession, and disorientation. The narrative begins by describing the slow, almost imperceptible deterioration of the home's occupants. Initially, subtle anxiety and unease gave way to chronic stress, sleeplessness, and a pervasive sense of unreality. Simple daily routines became fraught with uncertainty, as individuals struggled to reconcile their perceptions with the dissonant effects of the room. This psychological strain was compounded by the tension of secrecy and the fear of public judgment, creating an atmosphere of isolation both physically and socially. The collapse extended beyond personal experience into interpersonal relationships. Family members, once bound by shared routines and social norms, began to withdraw from one another, suspicious or fearful of their own reactions to the room's anomalies. Communication became strained, confessions of disorientation or fear were met with skepticism or denial. In some cases, individuals refused to enter certain areas of the house altogether, while others became obsessively drawn to them, documenting the room's effects in meticulous detail. The narrative emphasizes how the room's influence created a fractured household, with competing currents of fear, curiosity, and self-preservation shaping behavior. These social fractures underscore the room's role not only as a locus of temporal distortion but also as a catalyst for psychological and communal instability. Isolation extended to the wider community as well. The house acquired a reputation for danger and moral contamination, discouraging visitors and fostering superstition. Townspeople whispered warnings, some claiming the house was cursed, others insisting it was a test of spiritual faith. Over time, the property became physically and socially secluded, with overgrown gardens and crumbling walls reinforcing its separation from ordinary life. The narrative emphasizes the interplay between physical isolation and psychological impact. The more remote and inaccessible the house became, the more potent the effects of the room seemed, and the more pronounced the fear, obsession, and speculation surrounding it. Individuals directly affected by the room experienced profound disorientation. Accounts describe entering the room to accomplish a simple task, only to emerge hours, days, or even longer later with no clear memory of the interval. Clocks malfunctioned, objects shifted, and auditory and visual perception became unreliable. Some observers reported feeling detached from their own bodies or unable to reconcile the passage of time outside the room with the experience inside. These sensory and cognitive disruptions contributed to a growing sense of helplessness, as the boundaries between reality, perception, and imagination became increasingly blurred. The narrative frames these experiences as not merely frightening but existential, challenging fundamental assumptions about the continuity of self and the reliability of memory. The section also examines the psychological toll in more detail. Prolonged exposure to the room led to obsessive behaviors, anxiety disorders, and, in some cases, psychosis. Individuals who attempted to measure or document the room's anomalies often became consumed by their efforts, unable to disengage or find relief. Others withdrew completely, avoiding the house and limiting social interaction. Sleep disturbances, nightmares, and intrusive thoughts became common, reflecting the pervasive reach of the room's influence. The audience is drawn into the tension between human resilience and vulnerability, witnessing the slow erosion of mental stability under sustained exposure to a phenomenon that defies understanding. Stories of disappearances and mysterious absences further underscore the collapse and isolation. Certain visitors and residents vanished without explanation, their last known location often the room itself. Family members and townspeople reported sudden, unexplained departures, sometimes accompanied by the lingering sense of a presence that had been disturbed or released. These incidents heightened fear, reinforcing the house's reputation as a site of danger and reinforcing social isolation, as few dared to approach or investigate. The narrative presents these vanishings with a measured tone, emphasizing uncertainty and the limits of human knowledge rather than sensationalism, which deepens the psychological resonance of the story. Attempts to restore normalcy proved largely ineffective. Interventions by clergy, scholars, or family members had only limited success, as the room continued to operate independently of human expectation or control. Efforts to block access, seal doors, or remove objects were met with mysterious resistance. Objects would reappear, doors would be found unlocked, and temporal anomalies persisted. These failures reinforced the perception of the house as a site governed by its own rules, where human intention and authority were subordinate to a mysterious, unseen force. The narrative emphasizes the futility of conventional solutions, highlighting the tension between human agency and the room's inexorable influence. Cultural and social interpretations of collapse and isolation became more pronounced over time. Locals, unable to access the house directly, filled the gaps with stories, warnings, and symbolic narratives. Folklore framed the room as a place where time and morality were tested, or where spiritual forces held sway. These narratives shaped behavior and perception, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. Fear of the room heightened isolation, and isolation magnified the room's psychological and social effects. The audience begins to see the complex interaction between physical phenomena, human perception, and cultural interpretation, which together amplified the house's enigmatic power. By the end of this section, the audience witnesses the full scope of collapse and isolation. The room is no longer merely a site of temporal distortion, it has become a force that shapes behavior, social interaction, and psychological stability. Individuals and communities are affected, demonstrating the pervasive and multifaceted nature of its influence. The narrative leaves viewers with a sense of foreboding, understanding that the house and its room operate beyond conventional comprehension, challenging both rational explanation and human resilience. The stage is set for the subsequent examination of aftermath, local silence, and unresolved questions, as the consequences of prolonged exposure continue to ripple through history and memory. In the years following the height of the room's strange activity, the house settled into a state of eerie quiet, a silence that was both physical and social. The once bustling household was reduced to minimal occupancy, with only a few family members or caretakers willing to reside within its walls. Even among these individuals, daily life was heavily circumscribed, with routines shaped by fear of the room and the unpredictable anomalies it produced. The house, though intact in structure, seemed frozen in time, its corridors and rooms suspended in a state of latent tension. The narrative emphasizes the duality of this silence. It is at once a reprieve from constant disturbance and a haunting reminder of past chaos, a space in which memory and dread linger long after active observation has ceased. Locals, long accustomed to whispered warnings and fearful gossip, maintained a cautious distance from the property. Overgrown gardens and decaying stone fences became symbols of abandonment, marking the house as both physically and socially isolated. The community's collective silence reinforced the house's reputation, creating a feedback loop in which avoidance amplified mystique and fear. Folkloric interpretations continued to circulate, with stories of the room's power preserved in oral tradition even as direct observation waned. These accounts ranged from moral allegories to cautionary tales, serving both to explain the inexplicable and to deter curiosity. The narrative highlights how cultural memory functions as both preservation and suppression, shaping the understanding of events long after the immediate phenomena have faded. Individual experiences during this aftermath reveal the lingering psychological impact. Former residents and observers describe enduring anxiety, obsessive recollection of anomalous events, and persistent fear of returning to the house. Diaries and letters recount dreams or flashbacks in which time again appeared to distort, demonstrating the lasting impression of the room on memory and perception. Even for those who had avoided direct exposure, knowledge of the house's reputation created a subtle, pervasive unease, as if the psychological influence of the room extended beyond physical boundaries. These accounts underscore the long-term consequences of encountering the inexplicable, emphasizing that the room's effects are not confined to immediate observation but resonate across years and generations. Attempts to formally document or study the house in its post-collapse state were sporadic and often inconclusive. Scholars revisiting the property encountered inconsistencies: clocks functioned normally, objects remained undisturbed, and the room appeared innocuous. Yet anecdotal accounts suggested that the phenomena could return unpredictably, leading to a sense of cautious respect and hesitation. This ambiguity reinforced the house's mystique, illustrating the challenge of reconciling empirical observation with a body of lived experience that is irregular, subjective, and psychologically potent. The narrative stresses that the tension between what is measurable and what is perceived remains central to the story, maintaining suspense while underscoring the limits of human understanding. The social dynamics surrounding the house evolved in response to its reputation. Property owners, historians, and townspeople often treated the house as taboo, avoiding discussion or direct engagement. This deliberate neglect created an aura of mystery, allowing the house to operate as a symbolic space in the community's collective consciousness. Local folklore, moral interpretations, and sporadic anecdotal reports maintain a narrative thread linking past anomalies with present silence, reinforcing the idea that the room's influence extends beyond temporal and physical boundaries into the realm of cultural memory. The narrative frames this silence as both protective and haunting. It shields the living from direct exposure while preserving the power of the unknown in communal imagination. Accounts of lingering influence illustrate the psychological and emotional reach of the room even in the absence of immediate activity. Former residents report subtle distortions in perception, fleeting sensations of altered time, and a pervasive sense of being observed when near the property. These residual effects suggest that the house functions as a locus of memory and expectation, where past events shape ongoing perception and experience. The narrative emphasizes that the room's power is not solely a function of active anomalies but also of anticipation, fear, and historical awareness. The audience is invited to consider how human cognition and cultural memory can sustain a phenomenon long after its direct manifestation has ceased. The aftermath also examines property management and ownership over time. Successive caretakers struggled with the burden of the house's reputation, balancing maintenance with the need to avoid disturbing the room. Renovations were undertaken cautiously, often leaving original features untouched to preserve stability and minimize risk. The narrative highlights the careful, almost ritualized approach to interacting with the space, reinforcing the perception that the room operates according to its own rules and that human intervention can be precarious. These practical considerations add realism and texture to the story, illustrating the ongoing negotiation between human agency and an environment that resists control. Cultural interpretations continued to shape understanding of the house. Writers, historians, and folklorists examined the property through moral, symbolic, and psychological lenses, creating layered narratives that blended observation with interpretation. Some accounts suggested that the room serves as a metaphor for human obsession with time and control, while others framed it as a cautionary tale about curiosity, hubris, or spiritual vulnerability. The narrative emphasizes the richness of these interpretations, demonstrating that the house's influence persists not only in material phenomena but also in cultural imagination, memory, and storytelling. By the end of this section, the audience has a clear sense of the house's enduring presence and the lingering effects of the room's anomalies. Silence, isolation, and cultural memory converge to maintain a sense of unease, even in the absence of active disturbance. Individuals, families, and communities continue to negotiate the psychological, social, and symbolic consequences of what occurred within the room. The narrative frames the aftermath as both a resolution of immediate chaos and a continuation of mystery, emphasizing that while the room's active distortions may have diminished, their echoes persist in perception, memory, and story. This sets the stage for final reflection, unresolved questions, and enduring fascination in subsequent sections, as the house remains a locus of human curiosity, fear, and speculation. Decades after the initial disturbances within the house, theorists, historians, and curious observers attempted to synthesize explanations for the room's anomalous behavior. The narrative explores the convergence of scientific speculation, folklore, and philosophical reflection, highlighting how human beings grapple with phenomena that resist categorization. Some scholars propose that subtle environmental factors, such as unusual magnetic fields, air currents, or structural idiosyncrasies, might account for certain distortions in perception or timekeeping. Others suggested that the room functioned as an early experiment in psychological influence, perhaps exploiting sensory cues to create disorientation. These hypotheses, though grounded in observation and reasoning, were ultimately limited, as no empirical method could consistently reproduce or explain the phenomena. The audience is drawn into the tension between rational inquiry and the persistence of mystery, recognizing that the house operates beyond conventional understanding. Folkloric and symbolic interpretations remained equally compelling. Stories circulated that the room was haunted by ancestral spirits, a physical manifestation of guilt, trauma, or unresolved family history. Some suggested that the room existed outside linear time, creating a localized temporal anomaly that trapped individuals within a separate rhythm of reality. These accounts, while unscientific, offered a sense of narrative closure, framing the room's behavior in terms of moral, emotional, or spiritual significance. The narrative emphasizes that folklore serves not merely as an imaginative construct but as a mechanism for humans to confront the unknowable, providing structure and meaning in the absence of definitive explanation. The narrative also examines attempts to reconcile scientific and folkloric explanations. A small cadre of investigators posited that the room's anomalies might be the intersection of psychological susceptibility and environmental influence, with perception and expectation amplifying minor irregularities into profound disturbances. Observers noted that individuals who entered the room with skepticism often experienced different effects from those who approached with fear, superstition, or obsession. This interplay between mind and environment reinforces the story's central theme: the room's power is both objective and subjective, interacting with human consciousness in ways that defy simple categorization. By presenting these hybrid theories, the narrative underscores the complexity of the mystery, inviting the audience to consider multiple layers of causality and interpretation. Historical and architectural analysis contributes another dimension to final theories. Researchers examined the design, orientation, and materials of the house, hypothesizing that unique spatial configurations might produce perceptual distortions or subtle shifts in sensory experience. Ceilings, staircases, and walls were studied for irregularities, while lighting conditions and reflective surfaces were analyzed for their potential to affect visual perception. Though these inquiries yielded some insights into human sensory experience, they could not account for the reported temporal anomalies, vanishing objects, or disorienting psychological effects. This tension between plausible environmental explanation and unaccountable phenomena reinforces the narrative's slow-burning suspense, emphasizing that while rational analysis can illuminate parts of the mystery, it cannot fully resolve it. The section also addresses psychological and neurological perspectives. Modern theorists have speculated that the room might trigger extreme cognitive and perceptual responses, including temporal distortion, dissociation, and altered consciousness. Certain accounts resemble descriptions of altered mental states in clinical or experimental settings, suggesting that the room might act as a catalyst for latent psychological processes. The narrative examines these possibilities with care, balancing scientific reasoning with the preservation of the story's eerie and unsettling tone. By situating the room's influence at the intersection of mind, environment, and culture, the audience is encouraged to recognize that the phenomenon is multifaceted, resistant to reductionist explanation, and profoundly human in its impact. Despite extensive investigation, many questions remain unresolved. The exact mechanism behind temporal distortion is unknown, the variability of individual experience defies prediction, and the relationship between environmental factors and psychological response remains elusive. Reports of vanishing objects, auditory distortions, and perceptual anomalies continue to challenge both scientific and folkloric explanations. The narrative emphasizes the enduring uncertainty, framing the room as a locus of unanswerable questions that continue to fascinate, terrify, and provoke reflection. This unresolved nature is central to the story's power, as the audience is invited to inhabit the same space of curiosity, dread, and speculation as those who encountered the house firsthand. The human and cultural dimensions of the mystery are also explored. Communities surrounding the house have integrated its story into local lore, creating rituals, superstitions, and moral tales that persist to this day. Individuals with familial or historical connections continue to interpret events according to personal or cultural frameworks, blending observation, memory, and imagination. The narrative highlights how mystery is sustained through both lived experience and collective memory, showing that the room's influence extends beyond the physical to shape identity, behavior, and culture. This perspective reinforces the idea that unresolved phenomena do not vanish when observation ceases, they endure in memory, storytelling, and emotional resonance. The section considers philosophical implications as well. The room challenges fundamental assumptions about time, causality, and perception, raising questions about the nature of reality itself. Is time linear, or can localized distortions exist unnoticed by the broader world? How does human consciousness interact with space and environmental cues in ways that can produce profound disorientation? These reflections invite the audience to engage with the mystery not only emotionally but intellectually, exploring how extraordinary phenomena expose the limits of human understanding and the boundaries of rational inquiry. By framing these questions, the narrative sustains suspense while encouraging contemplation of deeper, more universal themes. By the conclusion of this section, the audience is fully immersed in the web of speculation, interpretation, and unanswered questions that define the house and its room. Scientific inquiry provides plausible mechanisms but no definitive answers. Folklore offers meaning but cannot account for empirical anomalies. Psychological analysis illuminates human perception but cannot explain environmental irregularities. The tension between these approaches sustains the narrative, leaving viewers with a sense of unresolved fascination and lingering unease. The story is positioned as an open-ended mystery, one that resists closure precisely because it intersects mind, culture, and environment in ways that remain unpredictable, incomprehensible, and profoundly human. Even decades after the peak of activity within the house, the room's legacy continued to ripple through both local history and broader cultural imagination. The narrative opens by exploring how physical remnants of the house, the worn floorboards, the slightly warped doorframes, and the subtle creaks and drafts, served as persistent reminders of the room's enigmatic influence. Visitors who dared approach often described an immediate sense of apprehension, a feeling that the space retained a residual tension as though the house itself remembered the disturbances of the past. This lingering atmosphere reinforced the perception that the room was not merely a historical curiosity but an enduring presence, capable of affecting human consciousness across time. The audience is invited to sense the house as a living, breathing entity, one whose legacy is inseparable from both space and memory. The story of the house extended into the realm of cultural memory, as local communities, historians, and folklorists preserved accounts of the room through oral traditions, diaries, and published accounts. Folktales intertwined with documented incidents, often embellishing or reinterpreting the events to align with moral or symbolic frameworks. Some stories framed the room as a cautionary tale about curiosity and hubris, while others portrayed it as a test of spiritual fortitude. These narratives served multiple functions. They preserved knowledge of the house, reinforced social boundaries, and transformed personal experience into collective myth. By emphasizing the cultural embedding of the house's story, the narrative demonstrates that the room's influence extended beyond temporal and spatial anomalies, shaping human understanding and imagination across generations. Individuals connected to the house also carried psychological legacies, long after their direct exposure to the room. Former residents, servants, and visitors reported enduring anxiety, hypervigilance, and a heightened awareness of time and spatial perception. Some developed obsessive behaviors, meticulously recording events in journals or seeking out similar anomalies in other locations. Others were haunted by fleeting sensations of disorientation or the impression that the room's influence lingered in their thoughts. These long-term psychological effects illustrate the room's ability to imprint itself on human consciousness, highlighting how encounters with the inexplicable can produce lasting emotional and cognitive consequences. The narrative emphasizes that legacy is not only material or cultural but profoundly personal and psychological. The enduring legacy also includes a broader impact on scholarship and investigation. Researchers revisiting the house decades later were confronted with a mixture of empirical evidence and anecdotal testimony, compelling them to navigate both measurable phenomena and human memory. Scientific studies offered partial explanations for environmental factors, while historical documentation provided context for the room's social and cultural significance. Yet no investigation could fully account for the anomalies or the emotional weight they carried. This tension reinforced the narrative's central theme: the room exists at the intersection of objective observation and subjective experience, and its enduring mystery challenges both rational inquiry and imaginative interpretation. Speculation regarding the room's nature continued to evolve over time. Modern theorists proposed models drawing on physics, psychology, and folklore to understand the anomalies. Some suggested localized temporal distortion or perceptual interference, while others entertained metaphysical interpretations, invoking spiritual or supernatural frameworks. Despite technological advancements and more sophisticated measurement tools, uncertainty persisted. The narrative emphasizes that speculation itself became part of the house's legacy, as theories, hypotheses, and conjecture shaped public perception, fueled curiosity, and ensured that the room remained a subject of fascination long after direct encounters had ceased. The audience is encouraged to engage with these speculative frameworks, understanding them as a testament to human creativity, fear, and the desire for comprehension. The section also addresses the symbolic resonance of the room. Beyond physical anomalies, the room came to represent broader human struggles, the desire to control time, the limits of rational understanding, and the confrontation with forces beyond comprehension. Artists, writers, and historians often invoke the house as a metaphor for the intersection of human curiosity and the unknown. In this sense, the room's legacy extends beyond specific events or experiences. It occupies a space in collective imagination as an enduring symbol of mystery and psychological tension. This interpretive dimension adds depth to the narrative, demonstrating that the house's influence is both concrete and abstract, shaping perception, culture, and storytelling simultaneously. The narrative highlights how memory and storytelling perpetuate the room's haunting influence. Accounts passed down through generations, diaries preserved in archives, and oral histories ensure that the room's mystery remains vivid, even for those who have never entered. Each retelling adds layers of interpretation, blending factual observation with emotional and symbolic resonance. The audience witnesses how the room's legacy is co-constructed by human perception, memory, and imagination, illustrating the interplay between objective events and subjective narrative. This dynamic ensures that the room continues to provoke wonder, fear, and speculation, maintaining its enigmatic presence in human consciousness. The story concludes by reflecting on unresolved questions. Despite decades of observation, investigation, and theorization, fundamental mysteries remain: the precise mechanism behind temporal distortion, the variability of individual experiences, and the room's broader psychological and cultural influence are all matters of speculation. This uncertainty reinforces the house's status as a locus of fascination, suggesting that some mysteries resist final resolution. The narrative emphasizes that the power of the room lies as much in its elusiveness as in the tangible anomalies it produces. The audience is left with a sense of lingering unease, an appreciation for the complexity of the mystery, and an understanding that the room's influence persists through memory, narrative, and imagination. By the end of this section, viewers comprehend the full scope of the house's enduring legacy: physical traces, psychological imprints, cultural memory, and symbolic resonance converge to create a phenomenon that transcends time and space. The narrative closes on an open-ended note, emphasizing that the room's influence is ongoing, residing not only within the walls of the house but also within the minds and imaginations of those who encounter its story. This final reflection ensures that the audience departs with a lingering sense of mystery, pondering the nature of time, perception, and human curiosity in the face of the inexplicable.